All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is daily vlog number 336. And today, I want to talk about some history. Recently, just because I was bored, typed into Google 10 most influential tabletop RPGs and got a lot of lists of video games, which annoyed the hell out of me. But one of the three actual tabletop RPG lists I could find actually had a mention of GURPS, which we will get to later. And they had a clip of an interview that Stephen Colbert did, which had me lose a lot of respect for Stephen Colbert. And the reason why, he's interviewing this dude that I can't remember his name, but the dude, he was an actor, played a geek in something. I don't know what. That's not really the point. And so Stephen Colbert goes, so, how did you, connect with this kind of geeky role? Is there anything in your real life that might have... And all the audience laughs because he looks like a geek. And then he talks about, he's like, yeah, I did play Dungeons & Dragons, but the real game that I played, the one that I was really obsessed with, is a game called GURPS. And Stephen Colbert had no idea what GURPS is. For anyone who doesn't know, GURPS stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System. And if you have been around in the tabletop RPG world for more than a couple years, you should know what GURPS is. Even if the only thing you have ever played is D&D 5th edition, you should at least be familiar with GURPS. And so it got me thinking, how many people in the tabletop RPG scene don't actually have a good understanding of the history of the genre? They might understand that D&D came out in 74, and in the 90s there was that whole White Wolf publishing thing, and then Pathfinder happened in the late 2000s, early to 2010s, and now we have D&D 5th edition, and that's all you need to know. And it's not. There are so many amazing, literally groundbreaking RPGs that have defined this space that I think a lot of people just are completely unaware of. So, starting today, I thought it would be fun to just go through a few choice examples of some groundbreaking tabletop RPGs and kind of what they introduced. So for today, I'm just going to cover the 70s and 80s because the 70s was dominated by TSR. And so I'm not really going to be mentioning too many different TSR things because Dungeons and Dragons created an entire genre of games. And then TSR went just nonsense in creating all these different tabletop RPGs. And none of them, as far as TSR games were concerned, none of them were as influential as Dungeons and Dragons was. So for the most part, with I think one exception, I'm not really going to be mentioning the various TSR TTRPGs in there. But so the 70s was a lot of TSR, and then a couple other studios started making games. And the 80s is when we really started to see much more variation. And so I figured if I put those two decades together, I'll have a decent video that I'm hoping is not going to be 7 hours long. We'll deal with the 90s and the 2000s and after that later. But yeah, so let's talk about the history of tabletop RPGs. The first game, Dungeons and Dragons. So, I've talked about Dungeons and Dragons ad nausea on this channel. I really don't think we need to talk about it too much, but we should explain the basics. There's two dudes, Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, used to play miniature war games. And miniature war games at the time were mostly things like reenacting World War II or stuff like that. They were big, massive, world-spanning battles and stuff like that. They eventually got interested in the idea, well, what about kind of medieval stuff? Because most of the war games are a little bit more modern. What about medieval stuff? I can't remember... Yeah, so Gary Gygax, along with a dude named Jeff Perrin, created a game called Chainmail, which was basically a miniature war games, but it was designed for medieval battles as opposed to kind of modern battles. That came out in 1971. All that predates Dungeons and Dragons. When we get to Dungeons and Dragons, around 1974, Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, or technically a little before then, had come up with this idea, well, what if instead of each player controlling an army, they only controlled one person? And what if that one person wasn't just a generic dude walking around? What if they were a hero, like, what we see in Lord of the Rings and stuff like that? And that was the genesis of Dungeons and Dragons. As far as who, quote-unquote, officially created Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of people argue about it. But as far as most people are concerned, it was kind of a combined effort between Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, because both of them took the rules for Chainmail and created their own campaigns. If I remember correctly, I think Dave Arneson, his campaign was it Blackmore? Yeah. So he created the Blackmore campaign setting. Gary Gygax created the Greyhawk campaign setting, which if you've looked at the new Dungeon Master's Guide, they have an entire chapter dedicated to Greyhawk as kind of an example of how to build your own setting. So that's Dungeons and Dragons. If you want more information about it, there are tons of channels that have done just shit tons of information on the history of the Dungeons and Dragons. I don't think we need to cover it anymore here. Moving on. The next tabletop RPG that changed the world is called Bunnies and Burrows. I'm thinking this one might be new to a lot of people, because Bunnies and Burrows in and of itself was not a particularly popular RPG. There weren't a bunch of like clones of Bunnies and Burrows or anything like that, but came out in 1976, so it was only 2 years after Dungeons and Dragons came out. And remember, back then, when a new tabletop RPG came out, it wasn't like you could go to your local Walmart or something and then go to the book section and pick it up. A lot of people, the only way that they were able to get these games is they'd have to go to a convention to pick it up, or hope that they could convince their friendly local game store or something to be able to get copies of it. And a lot of times, the game spread almost entirely by word of mouth, people sharing their rule books with friends and stuff like that. So Bunnies and Burrows, why was this game, why was this genre defining? Why does this change the world? Well, the interesting thing about Bunnies and Burrows is it was inspired by a book called Watership Down. If you've never read Watership Down, You really should. It is a phenomenal novel about bunnies. And it gives them kind of society, and it looks like a children's book. It is not. If you read it as a child, like I did, it will scar you for life. But it basically anthropomorphized rabbits in general, but it didn't turn them into humans. Like, it didn't go, well, here's his little rabbit house, and he gets in his rabbit car and drives off to the rabbit office. No, they still lived in warrens, and they still had to be afraid of foxes and things like that. It was just, they spoke like humans, and they had relationships and things like that. And that's what Watership Down was about. And so Bunnies and Burrows was meant to kind of give this feeling of playing a non-human character, and was the first game to ever encourage players to have non-humanoid roles, which I'm getting directly from the Wikipedia page. But yeah, Bunnies and Burrows, the first game, and it's like, well, what if you didn't play a human, or a tall, pointy-eared human, or a short, stocky human, or a really short, skinny human, or a human with horns? Like, that's what most tabletop RPGs do, is they have different flavors of human. And Bunnies and Burrows wasn't about that. You were playing rabbits. You were playing bunnies. The other thing that was unique about Bunnies and Burrows, it was also the first tabletop RPG to introduce a detailed martial arts system. And it introduced a skill system. And the reason that was important was Bunnies and Burrows, they didn't have like monsters that you had to fight. Yeah, there were things like foxes who try to eat bunnies and stuff like that. So they were natural predators. And because bunnies in general are relatively low on the food chain, that did create some danger. But the only true quote-unquote monsters in the Giga game were humans. And the idea of a bunny being able to take down a human, like, you know, a warrior might be able to take down a dragon in Dungeons and Dragons, it just doesn't make sense. And so Bunnies and Burrows really incentivize the players to find non-combat ways of dealing with a lot of situations. Doesn't mean that they didn't have combat, but they put a large emphasis on there are situations that you can't solve with fists, or paws in this case. So in order to give the players ways to resolve things without combat, they introduced the basics of a skill system, which is now present in every single tabletop RPG ever. They will all have skill systems, and skill systems are basically how you deal with non-combat encounters. The rules for combat are how you resolve combat encounters. Everything else in the game is generally resolved through whatever skill system you use. And they didn't have skills in the original Dungeons and Dragons. You had stats, and so you might be able to roll like a strength check to break down a door or something like that. But as far as having actual skills, like a lock-picking skill or a searching skill or something, wasn't a thing until Bunnies and Burrows. Now, I can't think of a single tabletop RPG that lists Bunnies and Burrows as its inspiration for using a skill system. So I'm relatively certain other systems created skill systems on their own as a kind of like parallel thinking thing. So I don't think Bunnies and Burrows inspired many tabletop RPGs, but it is unique in the idea that first tabletop RPG to encourage non-human player characters, first tabletop RPG to have actual rules for martial arts, and the first tabletop RPG to use a skill system. It's a really, really big deal, and not many people know anything about it. They did, who was it? We'll talk about GURPS in a little bit here, but there was like a supplement for GURPS that was like a Bunnies and Burrows supplement, and I believe in 2012 2019, there's a revised third edition that was published by Frog God Games. So, if you wanted to play Bunnies and Burrows, you can probably, in fact, I'm going to just check to see if you can actually get it on like drive-thru. I would be very, very surprised if you couldn't get it on drive-thru RPG. Yeah, you can actually. I found the Frog God Games. It's $25 for the. Try this again for the PDF. If you wanted to be able to play it, so very, very cool, very, very interesting, and again, it's just a cool idea for a tabletop RPG. Your bunnies, live your bunny lives. Moving on, as I lose my kiki cap. I need more water. Water is good for you. So, the next genre-defining game is Traveler. Talked about Traveler before. Traveler. Traveler is unique for a number of things. It came out in 1977, so again, only 3 years after. Only 3 years after D&D came out. It was one of the first, if not the first, I believe it was the first science fiction-based TTRPG. It was also one of the first, if not the first, of what are called skill-based RPGs. And if you're not familiar with the term skill-based, we'll try this one more time. Skill-based RPGs are not like harder RPGs. Skill-based RPGs are RPGs that instead of having a class that gives you a bunch of abilities you can use, skill-based RPGs are you have this long list of skills and you invest in certain skills, and there's always significantly more skills than any character could ever invest in. So you pick a subset of skills, and those are the things that your character is good at. So skill-based RPGs tend to be a little bit more complex and crunchy than your class-based ones, with a few rare exceptions, simply because they have to be. Because you technically can combine any skill with any other skill, balancing the things can become a little bit difficult. Traveler is still being published today. I have the most recent version of Traveler published, which came out in 2016. I think it's called they refer to as Mongoose Traveler Second Edition, because it's published by a company called Mongoose, and it's their second edition. That's the copy that I have. It was actually one of the games I was considering to use for my Metroid campaign, but I decided to use Lancer instead. But yeah, Traveler, again, came out in 77 and has been published regularly ever since then. It's had different versions of it. Like in 98, a GURPS version of Traveler was created, where it's basically a supplement for GURPS. 2002, there was Traveler 20, which I believe used the D20 yeah. He used the D20 system, which was basically the OGL. When D&D 3rd edition came out, all the games that basically used the same thing used the quote-unquote D20 system. So yeah, really amazing. It's considered... Oh, what's it called again? They refer to it as Space Opera, but it's a it's not like a Star Wars style space adventure where there's big lasers and space mages and stuff like that. No, it's a hard science fiction. That's what it's called. It's a hard science fiction thing. So it's based on what people thought actual space travel would be like, and things like that. So if you wanted to tell a more like 2001: A Space Odyssey style adventure, you have a little bit more with, or at least the original version of Traveler. The most recent one gets a little bit more in the fantastical, but you still don't have things like space wizards and stuff like that. So, yeah. Moving on. The next genre-defining tabletop RPG is Arduin. Arduin is considered the first cross-genre fantasy RPG. What that basically means was it was designed to be able to tell multiple kinds of stories. D&D was designed to tell very specific kinds of stories, basically Lord of the Rings and other stuff kind of like that. It was high fantasy. Bunnies and Burrows was meant to tell stories about bunny rabbits. Traveler was meant to tell space stories. You really didn't have these kind of universal systems until Arduin. Arduin itself came out same year as Traveler, came out in 97 or in 77. Sorry about that. And it was still primarily a medieval fantasy style thing, but they had other things where you could have interstellar wars to horror, historical drama. It was designed to be able to do a lot of different things, according to the Wikipedia page that I'm currently reading from. But nowadays, the idea of a generic tabletop RPG is not a new thing. There are tons and tons and tons of them, and quite a few companies, after they create a system for a tabletop RPG, will create a generic version for people to be able to use. Good examples are things like Numenera, which was the first use of the Cipher system. The Dragon Age RPG was the first use of the Age system, which eventually got two different flavors in Fantasy Age and Modern Age. So the idea of having a system where the entirety of the system is not built around a particular setting was relatively new with Arduin. Now, my understanding, Arduin in and of itself, I don't think is getting published anymore. I'm going to look before I say the wrong thing. Oh, maybe not. No, and apparently in 2023, the last publication before 2023 was Arden Eternal in 2009. But in 2023, they released Arden Artifact and Monster Card Set, which I don't know what that is. And then it looks like a bunch of maps in 2024. So I'm not sure if Arduin is still being published or not. But it's still a cool system, and the old versions of it you can probably find online somewhere. Yeah. Moving on. Moving 1 year forward, we get to talk about RuneQuest. Now, RuneQuest in and of itself is really not that amazing a thing. It's not that it's a bad RPG system at all, but it's kind of derivative of Dungeons and Dragons. It didn't make massive waves in the world or anything like that. Not like one of the later games we're going to talk about in a little bit here. But the thing that makes RuneQuest unique and genre defining is it was the first game to use what was called the basic role-playing system. It's a dumb name, but the basic role-playing system is eventually what was used to power Call of Cthulhu, which is the second most played tabletop RPG in the world. Second or third, depending on when you're measuring it. And one of the biggest reasons why is in Japan, it is the number one tabletop RPG by a huge amount. D&D, Pathfinder, and Sword World, which we'll talk about in a little while, they all fight for second place compared to Call of Cthulhu. So RuneQuest was the first game system to use the basic role-playing system. And the basic role-playing system in and of itself is a percentile-based system. Effectively, it's a skill-based RPG, so you generally don't have classes. If I remember correctly. Everyone, if I'm getting anything wrong here, feel free to correct me in the comments down below. But what you do is you roll 2d10, and they give you a percentage that you can roll. You can roll anywhere from 1 to 100. And generally, I know how it works in more modern Cthulhu games, is you will have a skill, you will invest a number of points in the skill, and then you have to roll under your skill number to succeed. So if you have like a 20 in firing a gun, let's say, or swinging a sword, I don't know what the skill would be in RuneQuest, but if you have a 20 in bladed weapons, let's say that's a skill, you would have to roll 2d10, and then the one die would be your ones place, one die would be your tens place, and if you rolled under a 20, you either rolled a 20 or under, you succeeded. If you rolled 21 or over, you failed. It's a fascinating style of gameplay. And again, while RuneQuest in and of itself still exists today, I believe you can still, they have, what was it? The most recent version of it that's been published by a company called Chaosium is RuneQuest Role-Playing in Glorantha. That came out in 2018. So it's not like RuneQuest doesn't exist anymore. It is still being supported. It's gone through a bunch of different publishers over the years, which is true of just about every single tabletop RPG that has existed for a long time, is they will get sold off. I mean, even Dungeons and Dragons used to be TSR, and now it's Wizards of the Coast. So, but yeah, if you're interested in a percentile dice-based fantasy RPG, that's what RuneQuest is. And there's still modern versions of it being published today. So, yeah. Moving on. The next genre-defining tabletop RPG is Gamma World. Now, remember how I said I wasn't going to talk about a bunch of TSR products? You're right. Gamma World was published by TSR. However, the thing that makes Gamma World, in my personal opinion, a genre-defining thing is not the fact that it's a post-apocalyptic science fiction RPG. There's tons and tons and tons of those, and there's quite a few that were significantly more impactful in the tabletop RPG world than Gamma World was. I know a lot of people are not even aware that Gamma World exists. The most recent publication, the 7th edition of it, was published in 2010. And it actually, the thing with Gamma World is effectively a Dungeons and Dragons conversion. It not only uses similar, if not identical, mechanics to Dungeons and Dragons, and every single version of Gamma World, whenever it was published, it was designed to be compatible somewhat with the current version of Dungeons and Dragons. So it quite literally is one of the first full conversion mod kind of things for D&D. Again, it was never massive. Like I said, I know a lot of people that are very into tabletop RPGs in general that are probably either just barely recognize that Gamma World was a thing or completely unaware of it. It's not that, again, all of these, later Giga games go, oh yeah, it was Gamma World that made me want to make this. It's just that it was the first time that we started seeing someone taking, well, I like this rule set, but I don't like this setting. So what if we just took the rule set and made something different? That's where Starfinder came from. And you would see this over and over and over again. As we get into the 80s, we start seeing a lot of licensed products. I don't think I talk about too many of the licensed products here in this particular thing. But a lot of that came from the idea of, well, we have a rule system. What if we get rid of all the flavor and adapt the rule system to this particular world? Gamma World maybe wasn't the absolute first game to do this, but it was one of the first that did it really well and did it to the point where the Gamma World characters were effectively compatible with the equivalent D&D edition, which is something, again, you see nowadays all the time. Things like in the Cypher system, which I talk about a lot because I'm currently running a Cypher system campaign for Zelda Universe. You can use rules from Numenera in the Strange game, and you can use stuff from they have so many different campaign settings and different stuff like that. Like, you can mix and match rules all the time, but that was, and your character from one game for the most part can fit into another without too much difficulty. That really wasn't a thing in early tabletop RPGs. If you were playing a tabletop RPG, your character only fit in that tabletop RPG. And Gamma World was really the first one where it wouldn't be a great fit in any way, shape, or form. But theoretically, the rules were compatible enough that you could take a Gamma World character, put them in D&D, and they would still technically work. Wasn't a great fit or anything like that, and I don't think anyone ever did that. But it was something that was possible, and now is relatively commonplace for more generic tabletop RPGs that kind of give you a bunch of different settings, like the Fate system, like the Cypher system, like Savage Worlds, things like that. So, yeah. Moving on. Sorry, I have to find the next thing. There we go. So, we are finally getting out of the 70's now. I need to take a drink. We're getting into 1980. And I'm only going to mention this because, again, it leads into the next thing we're going to be talking about. But Chaosium in 1980 actually releases the basic role-playing system as its own thing. So, again, as far as it being a kind of generic role-playing system, it was one of the earlier ones. I don't think it was the absolute first generic role-playing system. I probably talked about it earlier. Yeah, I mean, technically Arduin was your first kind of cross-genre, kind of generic role-playing system. However, the basic role-playing system was, again, it was something that, again, happens now all the time. You started with Numenera, then you got the Cypher system. You started with the Dragon Age RPG, then you get the Fantasy Age system. It happens really, really often where a game company will create a unique tabletop RPG, and then they will take the system that powers that RPG and kind of boil it down to its basics and release it as its own kind of standard thing. And that's what happened with the basic role-playing system. Or it's really just called basic role-playing. There's no system involved, and a lot of people call it just BRP, but it is a system. So that's what I refer to. So basic role-playing is, again, it's a percentile-based system. It's skill-based, and again, it would eventually be used to power the Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG. Another thing that's kind of interesting, in 2020, Chaosium released an SRD, excuse me, for the basic role-playing system. So basic role-playing still exists today. Obviously, Call of Cthulhu has been going for a long time, but the actual system, underlying system of it still exists. And they released a new version of it in 2023 called called Basic Role-Playing Universal Game Engine. So yeah, if you're interested in a percentile-based, skill-based system, you check it out and create your own game around it. So yeah. Moving on. About a year after the basic role-playing system came out, another game came out called Call of Cthulhu. Again, if anyone's not familiar with it, Call of Cthulhu is an H.P. Lovecraft-inspired game. And probably one of the more unique things about Call of Cthulhu is you are not playing heroes. You are playing investigators, and the stuff that you're investigating is so much more powerful than you. And the deck is stacked so incredibly against you that hopelessness is kind of a key component of Call of Cthulhu. As much as, again, RuneQuest was the first basic role-playing game, they released the BRP system in and of itself as its own a year before. Call of Cthulhu is the first one that really got it right. Call of Cthulhu in and of itself, again, was published in 81 and has been continually supported ever since then. Trying to see. So yeah, the various editions of Call of Cthulhu. First edition was 81, second edition 83, third edition 86, fourth edition 89, fifth edition 92, 5.5 98, 5.6 99, 5.6.1 2001, 20th anniversary edition 2001, 6th edition 2004, 7th edition 2014. So yeah, it has been supported since 81. Probably has the best and oldest support of any tabletop role-playing game aside from Dungeons & Dragons. I myself have played Call of Cthulhu. If you go to twitch.tv/ZeldaUniverseTV, if you go to the videos tabs, they actually have our Call of Cthulhu game where I got to play with my buddy DK and a couple other people. We got to play Call of Cthulhu. It is a fun system, but boy, is it not Dungeons and Dragons in any way, shape, or form. Again, you're playing investigators. You're investigating weird, strange stuff. And if you've ever read anything by H.P. Lovecraft, things do not go well for the main characters. The deck is stacked against you. Weird shit shows up, and you are more likely than not going to have problems. So it's this very... not confined. It's this very oppressive role-playing style. There's a lot of kind of mystery and investigation. It plays much more like a whodunit mystery than it does a story about heroes triumphing over evil. No, evil wins a lot in Call of Cthulhu, but It's an amazing system. Like I said, it's the #1 tabletop RPG and has been since, I want to say, like 2011, 2013, somewhere around there. In Japan, a lot of that because of what are called replays. I did an entire video on replays, but they're basically kind of like mangas that are retellings of people's tabletop RPGs. The first one of them is Record of Lawless War, which turned into turned into an anime and eventually created its own tabletop RPG system. But was originally a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. So anyway, yes, that's Call of Cthulhu. Moving on. The next game we talk about, and again, I need to find it here. We're going all the way up to 84. Not that nothing happened between 81 and 84. Again, there were tons of role-playing games coming out. Things like James Bond 007, role-playing in Her Majesty's Secret Service. There's a James Bond TTRPG. Came out in 83. Powers and Perils came out in 83 as well. Super World, which is another basic role-playing game, came out in 83. But they weren't like changing the world or anything like that. There was even Star Trek: The Role Playing Game came out in 83. Palladium came out in 83. So I'm not saying that nothing came out, but the one big one that really had a huge impact. Where are you? There we are. 1984. The role playing game Paranoia came out. If you're unfamiliar with Paranoia is a joke, and I mean that literally. Paranoia, I'm going to read right from the Wikipedia page because it's a perfect description of it. Paranoia is a dystopian science fiction tabletop role-playing game, and I guess they didn't mention it, it's a satire. Paranoia is all about living in this dystopian future where everything is kind of out to get you. The world is really, really messed up, and you're happy to live in it. One of my favorite things in the world, the city that you live in is controlled by a computer, referred to as friend computer. And so the players themselves are constantly interacting with friend computer, and everything in the game is designed to kill you, and you go through characters like they're M&Ms. And yeah, it's a nonsense game. Geek and Sundry ran a one-shot back when Critical Role was still on Geek and Sundry, where they, I think it was Ivan Van Norman, ran some of the Critical Role cast and a few guest stars. I think Felicia was in it. I think Will Wheaton, there we go, Will Day, no. Will Wheaton was in it as well. It's an absolute blast. You can find it on YouTube somewhere. I know it exists. But yeah, it was a silly tabletop RPG. It was not meant to be telling this amazing struggle against good and evil. It was meant to be unfair. It was meant to be silly. It was meant to be a satire. Even the rule book is limited. Like, players are not allowed to look at certain parts of the rule book depending on their quote-unquote security clearance. It's a nonsense game. Is it the first silly tabletop RPG? I can't say that for certain, but it's by far the oldest, most popular silly tabletop RPG. And again, it's still being published. The most recent version of it was actually released in 2023. It's called the all-new Shiny Edition. Before that, they had the 27 Red Clearance Edition. Another thing I really enjoy about it, first edition was released in 84. Second edition was released in 87. Fifth edition was released in 95. There isn't a third or fourth edition that I am aware of. They just went, oh, this is the fifth edition. And that's kind of how Paranoia works. It's a great game. You will not be running, a 7-year-long campaign playing Paranoia. If you can make it to 4 sessions, that's a good. That's impressive. Normally, your characters are dying left and right, but yeah, it's interesting. It's fun. It's silly, and yeah. Moving on. We're going to move forward a year to talk about probably, in my personal opinion, one of the most overly designed and, not my opinion, I think everyone will agree with this, crunchiest RPGs that have ever been created. Let's talk about GURPS. This was the thing that inspired this entire video, was the idea that I cannot believe Stephen Colbert, who claims to be a nerd, claims to be a huge tabletop RPG fan, has never heard of GURPS. GURPS is published by Steve Jackson Games. And Steve Jackson Games is still creating monumentally awesome stuff today. He's still working. Steve Jackson is an actual person. There's actually 2 different Steve Jacksons. There's one in the UK and there's one in the US. GURPS was created by the US flavor of Steve Jackson. And both of them work on tabletop RPGs. Not only do both of them work on tabletop RPGs, the US flavor of Steve Jackson actually worked for the UK version of Steve Jackson, or not for him, but for the same company they worked for, writing a few supplements to, I can't even remember which game it was, but he's just credited as Steve Jackson, and they never mention, it's like, oh yeah, this isn't the same Steve Jackson that wrote these other ones. This is a different Steve Jackson. So anyway, 85, Steve Jackson creates GURPS. And the story behind GURPS is actually pretty interesting. Steve Jackson had been active in the tabletop RPG world since, I want to say, 1980. And one of the things that was getting frustrating to him was there really wasn't a good, truly universal tabletop RPG system. Again, we've talked about other, more universal ones, like the basic role-playing system is technically a universal one, but it was so tied to the systems that preceded it, things like Call of Cthulhu and stuff like that. Steve Jackson just really wasn't happy with the percentile-based thing. So he decided, I am going to create a truly universal game system that you can run literally anything, and you can make any mechanics that you want in it. And that was the birthplace of GURPS, which again stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System. It has existed since 85, and I think the most recent version of it that has been published, I think, is 4th edition, which came out in 2004. That doesn't mean that it's not being supported or anything like that. I just don't think he's needed to update it since 2004, because it is a massively complex system. The basics of GURPS is basically, when you're creating your character, you have a number of points that you can use to invest in different abilities and stuff like that, kind of. But if you'd like more points, you can take basically negative skills or negative abilities that allow you to regain a few points. So basically there's certain abilities that you can kind of, it's like, well, I want my character to be able to do this, but I don't have enough points. Well, I'll take this negative aspect, and that will give you enough points so I can take this positive aspect. And so because of that, generally what happens with most supplements is they might introduce some new rules, but a lot of times all they really do is introduce the various building blocks are advantages, disadvantages, perks, quirks, and skills. So they would just introduce a new perk, quirk, skill, advantage, or disadvantage. That's really all you needed to do. And from that aspect, GURPS in and of itself is really kind of a mastery of generic universal systems. They created a way to resolve situations that truly was very generic and very universal, so that you could use this same system in so many different things, whether you're casting a spell, recruiting someone to your clandestine organization, or making sure that you dot all the I's and you cross all the T's in your sales report that you have to get to Janet before the end of the day. Otherwise, you're going to get your third written warning. And everybody knows once you get a third written warning, as much as it's technically a third written warning, it really is the final written warning, and they will start the process of getting you fired. I made up all that shit, by the way. So in that aspect, yeah, it is a really, truly unique system. However, it is so goddamn crunchy. There are so many... Like, GURPS is the kind of tabletop RPG that if I, in my humble opinion, that if I asked someone, hey, can you use Excel to create a tabletop RPG, they would have created GURPS. Like, it is just so number crunchy, heavy. I played in a GURPS campaign. I hated it. I own multiple GURPS books because despite the fact that I don't like the system, it is a genre-defining system. It is a one of the most important tabletop RPGs that have ever been created. Despite the fact that I hate the damn thing, it really inspired so many different tabletop RPGs, whether they will admit it or not. And again, GURPS was really good for a really, really long time of finding something and going, well, we'll make a GURPS supplement for that. So that you really could play anything you wanted, and if you didn't want to have to do all the work yourself, you could find a GURPS supplement. It's like, oh, I guess I can play this particular genre because we already have a GURPS supplement for it, so I don't have to make up the rules myself. So, yeah, that's GURPS. Moving on. To look through this again because I have to remember why I put this one on here. Oh, now I remember why. So, we're going to be moving forward again, this time to 1987. Where are you in the 1987s? So, we're going to be talking about Ars Magica. That's not ass. A-R-S Magica. And the reason I mention this particularly, it's a medieval fantasy game that in and of itself is not that impressive. However, something that is very unique, they originated what they call the troop style play. And what that is, not trope, troop. Basically, every player has a primary character, which in this they call it, is it a magus is what they call it? What do they call it? Yeah. So a magus, and that's kind of your quote-unquote main character. However, depending on what's going on, it doesn't always make sense for all these magi, or I guess they call them magi, yeah, plural magi. So all these magi to go off adventuring together. So another thing that you would do is you would create some companions, at least one, sometimes a couple, to your magus. That when your magus wasn't going out on an adventure, you would play one of your companions. And so this is one of the first systems where it actually encourages players to build and play multiple characters. And the other thing that's kind of unique about it, in addition to companions, which were not spellcasters, like magus, literally spellcaster, companions were generally non-magical characters. So everybody made a wizard in this game. And then you would also make like some rangers and fighters and stuff like that. That's not that they were called, but to put it in D&D terms, so that when your wizard wasn't off adventuring, you would have someone to play. And then, in addition to that, there would be a number of characters called grogs. Grogs, unlike companions, which are kind of unique, interesting characters, they're just not magic-based. Grogs are just kind of generic characters. Things like skilled peasants, bodyguards, watchmen, stuff like that. They're your generic NPCs that you would find in any adventure type of the thing. However, the interesting thing about grogs is grogs were not quote unquote owned by a particular player. What I mean by that is the magus belonged to one of the players, and each magus would have specific companions that also were kind of exclusive to a single player. You would have your magus and your companions that you could play. The grogs were communal. They belonged to the group itself, and anyone could play any one of the grogs. And again, it was all entirely based on, well, what would make the most sense for this particular adventure. Now, I hear a lot of you asking, and by hear a lot of you asking, I mean the voices in my head are asking. I don't remember ever hearing of another game that encouraged you to make multiple characters that you just randomly play. I can't, off the top of my head, think of another character quite like Ars Magica. However, what I can tell you is Westmarch campaigns use a similar kind of system. Any organized play campaign effectively uses a very similar system where you're encouraged to have multiple characters, because it might be that in this particular adventure you already have a wizard coming, you don't need two of them, so this time I'm going to play my barbarian, or this time I'm going to play my bard, or something like that. So as much as I can't think of another, and if you guys do know of any other games that use this troop system, let me know in the comments down below. I personally can't come up with another game that uses this particular troop system, but it does inspire a lot of mechanics that are now really, really commonplace. Things like the West Marches campaign, and stuff like that. So yeah, I found it interesting because I'd never heard of it. I'd never heard of the troop system, and apparently the 4th edition, which is not the most current edition, 4th edition came out in 96, the 5th edition came out in 2004. According to the Wikipedia page, the 4th edition has been distributed for free at Warehouse 23, which is, I'm assuming, a website. I will look it up right now. Yeah. Which is fronted by, who is it? Steve Jackson Games. But effectively, you can get the 4th edition version of it for free. Or at least that's what the Wikipedia page says. So if you want to explore something kind of really interesting and unique, and it's not to say that you can't use a troop system in D&D 5th edition or anything like that. It's just D&D 5th edition was not designed around that, whereas Ars Magica was and is. So, yeah. Moving on. The next genre-defining role-playing game, we go to 1988 with the release of Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk, in and of itself, the original version of it was originally released as Cyberpunk. Now it's referred to as Cyberpunk 2013. most people nowadays are more familiar with what's called Cyberpunk 2020, which was, I think that came out in the 90s, and it was kind of the updated of a version. And nowadays, the most recent version of, 1990 was Cyberpunk 2020. 2005 was Cyberpunk 3.0, and then in 2020, they released Cyberpunk Red, which is the most current version of the Cyberpunk tabletop RPG. But again, the thing that makes this genre defining, this was, I don't know if we can call it the absolute first Cyberpunk tabletop RPG, but it is by far the first most popular one. It took inspiration, fun fact, it takes inspiration from a few different things, and a lot of people assume that it took inspiration from Gibson, William Gibson, specifically Neuromancer, which Neuromancer in and of itself is one of the defining novels that helped not really create, but really solidified the cyberpunk genre. However, Neuromancer came out in... When did Neuromancer come out? Neuromancer came out in 84. Before that... Or actually, no. Actually, this came out after. So yeah, I think Neuromancer actually defined the genre. Getting this wrong. There's another book by Walter John Williams called Hardwired. And that was actually the thing that inspired cyberpunk. Hardwired and the film Blade Runner were two things that really... inspired this world of cyberpunk. And then after, the guy, Mike Pondsmith, was the guy that created the original cyberpunk. He eventually read Neuromancer. But Hardwire and Blade Runner were the two things that really inspired him to create this game. And cyberpunk, I think one of my favorite things about cyberpunk, I'm, again, reading this directly from the Wikipedia page, but this is so great. As cyberpunks, players embrace body modification, cybertech, and bioengineering. They live by 4 tenets. Style over substance, attitude is everything, always take it to the edge, break the rules. That's what cyberpunk was all about. It was designed, like, these were punks, but they were futuristic punks with robot parts and, like, swords that would come out of their arms. And it is... Cyberpunk is the most nonsense tabletop RPG ever. It's just absolutely nonsense, crazy, incredible. If you want a seat of your pants ride of a tabletop RPG, play Cyberpunk. Any of the versions of Cyberpunk, they're all fantastic. The Cyberpunk game that came out that was panned at launch because it was just a massive buggy mess, and now it's a really, really great game because they fixed all of it. That uses a modified version of the Cyberpunk TTRPG rules, in the same way that Vampire the Masquerade, the video game, technically used Vampire the Masquerade rules to create your character, or like Neverwinter Nights uses the 3rd edition of D&D. They have to modify it so it works in a tabletop RPG, or it works in a video game, but it's the same basic thing. So if you enjoyed Cyberpunk the video game, or you enjoyed Cyberpunk Edge Runners, which is the anime series, which is amazing and awesome, try out Cyberpunk. Again, it changed the world of tabletop RPGs by creating this, not only just the cyberpunk genre, but the idea that your characters are rebels and they're going out and they're sticking it to the man and everything like that. Like, that really wasn't a thing in tabletop RPGs. Most of the time you were playing heroes, and this was, these are rebels, and it's all about, fighting the power and all that stuff. Really, really cool stuff in it. So yeah. Moving on. We're now reaching near the end of the 80s. And again, I'm not saying that nothing came out between Cyberpunk and this next one we're going to talk about. Things like GURPS Conan came out in 1989. Remember I said that GURPS would get these supplements for particular things? GURPS Conan was if you wanted to play a game in the Conan the Barbarian universe, you could use GURPS to do it. However, the next one that definitely defined a genre is Shadowrun. If anyone is unfamiliar with Shadowrun, Shadowrun is another cyberpunk game, but unlike Cyberpunk, Shadowrun is a cyberpunk fantasy. So in addition to it being set in a kind of near future society, where it's not like off in space or anything, but they do have futuristic tech, in addition to that, there are elves and orcs and dwarves and things like that, and there is magic combined with all of the technology and stuff like that. And it makes for a really interesting, absolutely amazing game. And the name, in and of itself, is actually a really good description of kind of the point of the game. The name Shadowrun is actually an in-game name. It's not like when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, you're not going to be, wandering around Waterdeep and someone going, "Hey, would anyone help me defeat this dungeon and dragon?" That's just what they call it. Shadowrun in the Shadowrun universe actually is the name of a specific thing. Again, reading directly from the Wikipedia page. A Shadowrun, a successful data theft or physical break-in at a rival corporation or organization, is one of the main tools employed by both corporate rivals and underworld figures. The thing about Shadowrun is the world is run by corporations and illegal criminal underworld figures that are sometimes corporations in and of themselves. So Shadowrun is even more so than Cyberpunk, where Cyberpunk, again, is about sticking it to the man. Shadowrun is kind of that idea of capitalism taken to an extreme, where you no longer have governments, you have corporations that run everything. And corporations will hire your characters to do shadow runs. Yeah, it's a nonsense interesting system in and of itself. It is if I remember correctly, it is a skill-based system. However, I don't know how early they introduced it, but I know in all the modern versions, I think it might go all the way back to the first version, they do have quote-unquote classes. They're not actually classes. What they will do is they will give you examples of, like, a street samurai. If you want to be a street samurai, take these skills in the beginning. Which years ago I mistook that for it being a class-based system, and it isn't. But like I said, the kind of whole point of Shadowrun is the idea that the world is not only a messy place, but your characters in and of themselves are messy characters, and there really aren't that many quote-unquote good guys. There are just lesser levels of bad guys, and you have to kind of decide, well, do I want to work for this corporation because they're going to pay me good money? Do I want to work for this underground, underworld group that's fighting against the corporation, but they might be just as evil as the corporation? Like, this is like the definition of there really isn't a good answer. There's just less bad ones. And that doesn't mean that you can't play an altruistic or heroic character, but if you're going to try to do that, the world is going to do everything it can to show you that that was the wrong choice. I'm not saying that it is the wrong choice. The world is going to do everything it can do to try to convince you of that. And yeah, Shadowrun, again, has been, first publication was in 89. And the most recent version of it is 6th edition, which is 2019. I think right now on Humble Bundle, there's a Shadowrun 4th Edition bundle, which depending on who you talk to, starting with 5th Edition, I think it is when the game went completely to crap and it's unplayable anymore. But I've heard both 3rd Edition and 4th Edition have been talked about very, very nicely. And 6th Edition and 5th Edition, I think I think 6th Edition. And I have no problem with it. I think it's a great system in and of itself. But again, it's different than the earlier editions, and that's going to make anyone upset. So, yeah. Moving on. The last RPG I want to talk about is actually an RPG that I'm relatively certain, unless you are really, really into the Japanese tabletop RPG scene, you have probably never heard of Sword World. Sword World, remember when I mentioned before replays? Replays are manga, effectively, that somebody takes a kind of play-by-play of their tabletop RPG campaign and then illustrates it and writes it down and turns it into a little like light novel. So not technically a manga, but light novels are kind of halfway between like a comic book and a manga, or a book, like a traditional book and a manga. So the first one of these replays is again called Record of Lotus War, and it was a D&D campaign that they turned into a replay and was massively popular. It was so popular, there's an anime TV series that came out, I think in the late 80s, early 90s. You can watch, I think they've got it on Crunchyroll, and I've started watching it. It is old school anime. If you've never watched like early anime, and you're watching it in English like I do, because I have really bad double vision and a brain that doesn't like focusing on two different things at once, so watching things with subtitles is really hard for me. But it is one of the reasons that tabletop RPGs became as popular as they are in Japan. And replays are the reason that Call of Cthulhu is as popular as it is in Japan, because Call of Cthulhu replays are really, really popular. Well, the first version of Sword World was actually created, if I remember correctly, the first version of Sword World was actually created to be able to tell Record of Lotus War stories. And the initial campaign setting for it was a setting called Forcelia. And one of the areas in Forcelia is a place called Lotus Island, which is where Record of Lotus War was from. So it was originally created to be something that could be used for continuing the Record of Lotus lore actual game itself, not the replays, because I think, if I remember correctly, they eventually started feeling like D&D was just not working for the stuff they wanted to do, so they created the system. It's what's referred to as a 2d6 system, so you roll 2d6 for all of your rolls. And it's not just straight, whatever I get on there. There's this thing called a rating table, where depending on the key number, the rolls that you have to make are going to be different and give you different results and things like that. So kind of a combination of, if you've played early D&D, everything is on a table. Everything is on a table. It's really, really annoying. So, the interesting thing about Sword World has never officially been translated for the Western market. It is almost exclusively a Japanese tabletop RPG. Does that mean that you can't play it? You can? No, there are some fan translations. I think I have a version of it. I think it's Sword World 2.5. I have a fan translation of it just so I could learn how the system works and everything like that. But it has never been localized for the Western market, which I find fascinating. And again, up until, I want to say, like I said, around, I think it was like 2011 or 2014, somewhere around there. Up until that point, Sword World was the #1 RPG in Japan. And the big reason why Sword World got booted out is as YouTube became more popular, replays stopped being published as light novels, which was an expensive process. You had to have a publisher, and so it wasn't. And they started doing replays as YouTube videos, where the barrier to entry was significantly lower. And for the YouTube videos, the Call of Cthulhu replays just took off and became insanely popular. So, yeah, like I said, it's your kind of. The other thing that's kind of unique about it, it's referred to as a combination of class-based and skill-based. It's very, very unique. And like I said, it is really kind of defined tabletop RPGs in Japan. It's no longer the #1 RPG in Japan, but it's fighting for #2 with D&D and Pathfinder and a few other ones. And it regularly shows up as the second most popular tabletop RPG. Yeah, like I said, it's a fascinating system. I really would love for them to localize it so that we could have a version in the US, because it is a really, really cool system that I would love. Heavy anime inspiration, of all now there's quite a few different anime RPGs, but Sword World was the first anime RPG. So, yeah. Moving on. So, that is the 70s and 80s in the history of tabletop RPGs. Now, again, I did not talk about every single game. There are dozens upon dozens of games that were published between 1974, when D&D was first published, and 1990. I picked a few that made big changes in the world of the tabletop RPGs, and kind of started tracking things in different directions that can still be seen to today. But there's always a chance that I missed something really, really big. So if you are an RPG nut like I am, and I missed a particular genre-defining tabletop RPG published either in the 70s or the 80s, the first time, not that it was only exclusively published there, but the first publish was somewhere between 1974 and 1989, let me know in the comments down below. In addition to that, is there a tabletop RPG either you didn't realize existed and now you're interested in, or that you're like, oh, finally, someone's talking about this RPG, which is amazing and wonderful? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, this is all for me today. I will see you guys next time, hopefully dealing with some more tabletop RPG history. So, bye-bye.